If you want to open an offshore bank account to protect your money, earn higher interest rates, or just diversify your money around the world and into different currencies, today I'm going to walk you through the process that I go through from determining which bank to bank with to how to actually open the account. The first thing that you want to do is you want to find the right bank. Well, that might sound pretty obvious. We want to start by figuring out why are we opening an offshore bank account. Are we looking to diversify a large amount of money, perhaps into different investments into other countries? You might be looking at some kind of private bank. I think those are often overrated, but maybe some kind of Swiss bank or Singaporean bank that offers a whole suite of services designed for higher depositors. You have to ask yourself, do I have somewhere in the low to mid six figures all the way up into the low to mid seven figures to do that? If not, maybe you don't want to start there quite yet. Am I just looking to have a transactional account because I'm moving overseas and I want to pay bills? Well, that one's pretty easy. You're looking in the country where you're moving. But just because you're moving to a country doesn't mean you want to bank there. We have people who move to Mexico who work with us. They may have a transactional account in Mexico, but they're not moving all their wealth to Mexico. Are you looking for a transactional account just to use as you're traveling the world, have access to different currencies? Are you looking to have, maybe it offers you better online banking? Maybe you just want to put some money somewhere else and just be able to spend it, right? Maybe you want to get your salary into a foreign bank. Or are you looking to get a residence permit? Are you looking to get citizenship? Are you looking for kind of an entire plan B, and then opening a bank account helps you do that? So you want to figure out why you're opening a bank account. There's many different reasons to do it. You can open bank accounts in your own personal name. That's going to give you the most number of options. If you set up some kind of offshore company, as a holding company, is some kind of asset protection vehicle, there's different kinds of banks that open for those. If you're going to open up an offshore trust, there's a more limited number of banks that will open up for those. And the Singapore bank that will open for you personally with a high level of service doesn't really do that much with trusts. You're going to be looking at more banks that are offshore or in Switzerland for the trust. The company depends on where the company banks. So oftentimes the best place to start is the simplest place. You have a bank account. And I think people often try and overdo it when it comes to opening a bank account overseas in terms of the asset protection. Just having the money somewhere else offers some level of asset protection. And so you can start there and work your way up. So you want to make a hit list of banks to target and start. We have a list of about 1,500 different banks that we've talked to. Some used to work and no longer do. Some have never worked. Some are run by jerks. Some do a great job and we send our clients there. What you want to understand is that it's not necessarily guaranteed that if you say, hey, here's the one bank I want to open with, that they're going to open with it. Let's say you're going to go to Singapore. Singapore is more difficult these days with non-residents. There are some things you can do to increase your chances. But if you're going to go to Singapore, I might make you appointments with different banks in Singapore. So the person who's going to go to Singapore is someone who wants a high standard of service in an asset haven with excellent customer service, with excellent security, stability, and the banks in Singapore aren't failing. They want the whole suite of services, and they want it at a lower price and more transactional than one of the more stodgy options in Europe, like a Switzerland or like a Liechtenstein or even than an Andorra. It's more transparent, it's more lightweight, you get more control. You want to put, $500,000 in a Singaporean bank and just manage it yourself, or just throw it in a term deposit. You're going to get better interest rates. You can set that up yourself. You'll have a banker to help you with that deposit rate, but you're not going to, have someone demanding that you have them managing your money a banker's way. Okay, so that's one area. If you find the right bank, if you have that kind of money, Singapore is more difficult, but you can go there. If you're like, I want someone to handle everything for me, old school, and I'm going to put $1 million into most accounts, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Andorra sometimes can be a little bit lower than that, down to maybe $500,000, 300,000 even. Those banks can work. If you want something in Europe and you're not ready for that level of expense, and there's banks in Portugal that'll take you for the 5 figures. In Eastern Europe, you've got places like Georgia still available. Serbia, Montenegro, Armenia, more difficult. We've talked about those in years past. You want a number of different things that you could want. I happen to think that, having an account anywhere you live to pay bills, and so if you're buying homes around the world, if you have a residence permit, spend time in other countries, have a bank account there and be able to pay your local bills. I have a property in Serbia, for example, and so the only way to pay those bills is either to go there in cash or to have a Serbian bank account, because they're paid in dinars. It's not a currency that's widely available, even through some of the money transfer services. And so I have that local bank account. I log in and pay my bills. And you can put up to $50,000 in a Serbian bank, and you're covered under the insurance plan. It's it's worked in that part of the world before, that a bank goes under and they give you your 50 grand back. But more than that, but that's an example of kind of a place that you have a property there you could use, or it's kind of a smaller asset haven. So I'm a fan of, accounts where you live. I'm a fan of having some transactional accounts where it's just zippy, lightweight. Maybe there's some rewards, maybe, a lounge card for the airport. Georgia's an example of this, where they've just got good online banking. You probably don't want to put your entire, net worth in a Georgian bank, but, it's zippy, it's efficient, they don't bother you a lot. You would choose it, even if you didn't live there, it'd be a place that's efficient. Some of the banks in Portugal are okay. I know that they're a bit more particular for non-residents, but you can still open those. Historically, banks in the Czech Republic, for example, a little bit higher minimums. It's not as easy there anymore either. I mean, generally speaking, opening bank accounts overseas in countries where you're not a resident gets harder. The numbers, and where it's not as hard, the numbers keep going up. So I would have, where I live, I would have a transactional account, and I would have kind of wealth storage or investment accounts, depending on what I wanted my preferences to be. If I want the bank to manage my money, I'll have a discretionary account. If I, want to manage my own money, maybe I just have a separate brokerage account, and I'm going to plug that into a bank account somewhere. If I'm looking at doing property deals somewhere else, I've talked before about, having regional accounts. So, if you're looking at buying property in Egypt for the citizenship by investment program, you can send that money into your account from overseas. Dubai, a bank in Dubai is going to understand that you're sending money to Cairo more than a bank in Canada is, maybe even more than a bank in Singapore is. I'm not saying that those other banks won't let you do the transaction, but if you're looking at certain parts of the world, it might not hurt to have access there. And by the way, if you want to do investments yourself, Singapore offers that. There's certain funds you can buy in markets that are kind of tough to invest in. India's stock market's tough for non-residents, for example. Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, difficult markets to get in a lot of brokerage accounts. Your bank can either open a brokerage accounts you can trade in, on your own. They may also offer kind of funds where, hey, here's the Indonesia fund. I actually did pretty well with an Indonesia fund at one point. And that's a market that my brokerage account, which has access to a lot of different markets, wouldn't give me access to. So we're going to find the right bank. We're going to make a hit list, or we're going to get started. Panama is going to be one of the more extreme versions of it always changes person to person. They've got a lot of different banks in Panama. And it's really hard to recommend a particular one because you have a good experience with one person and then the next person you think is similar and they're just, I'm not so sure. So don't plan on here's the one bank I'm going to go to. Make a list of a couple different countries. Switzerland's going to have a cost. Everyone would like to go to Switzerland, but Georgia is accessible to everybody. We have someone who helps people open accounts remotely in Georgia. You don't really need to put any money in there. Put $1 in there, right? Obviously, if you know people, we know people. And so we had folks at Nomad Capitalist Live opening accounts in Malaysia, which generally is more difficult as non-residents. But they understood why these people were coming, which is generally a reason why, a lot of banks, both the central bank breathes down their neck, don't open accounts for non-residents. We can't do proper due diligence on them. We don't need the money in this case of some banks. They're just awash with cash, which is a good thing for banks. Or they don't understand why you're coming to their country. I remember I went to Bosnia many years ago. I don't think I wanted to open a bank account in Bosnia, but I was just traveling around and I walked into the bank and I'm like, hey, I'd like to open an account. And the guy's like, why? And I'm like, I just thought I'd maybe keep a few bucks in Bosnia. He's like, are you okay? And he kind of eventually walked me through the process. But you want to find the right bank. To do that, I would hone in on a particular, type of country. US, even if you can go there, may offer accounts for non-residents at some of the larger banks. You're often looking for some of the larger banks. If you know someone or if you got a niche need, the smaller banks could be okay. But like in Singapore, those niche banks are not going to open for you. It's going to be the larger banks. The big three are getting tighter, but now you're seeing the other international, like a Citibank or something, might be more amenable. The second thing you want to do, just as a precaution, is you want to get in early. So no faffing around here. Yeah, as we mentioned in Singapore, a couple of those larger banks don't really take non-residents anymore. Some of these new safe havens are ones you haven't heard of. I feel more comfortable keeping money in Georgia with those banks, which are publicly traded in London, than I would with some kind of cooperative bank in Ecuador, even though Ecuador uses the US dollar. I can hold US dollars in Georgia too. I might, quite frankly, feel more confident with a bank in Georgia than I would, with a bank in a couple of EU countries. Who knows what could happen geopolitically. But you want to get in early because generally once you open an account, you can be grandfathered in. So I have an account in Singapore at a bank that's probably the most difficult of all. And I've had it for a long, long time. And all I have to do is keep $1,000 in there, Singapore dollars. That was one where it's like, do I want to close this? Because you'll never get it back. But if you get in early, you can often be grandfathered in. Now, let's talk how to open it. What are the ways, once you've identified, am I going to Switzerland or am I going to Georgia or am I going somewhere in between? How do I want to open an account? The first way is you go in person. This is going to be easier in the sense of they get to see your passport, they can scan it, they can see you face to face. You're not going to have to go around notarizing documents and doing all kinds of certifications and e-notaries on whatever different banks want you to do. Let's say I've chosen to go to Singapore. I'm just going to go and visit different banks. I know that calling ahead can have some value, but you're probably not going to get, in many cases, a banker who's going to really take you that seriously. I have bankers in different places around the world that I found that they're great. It's like I sent all my business there. I had a banker in Malaysia. He switched banks recently, so I switched banks with him, and it made it really easy for me because he's the easiest guy to talk to. You're probably not going to get him on the phone if you call. It's kind of the luck of the draw. You're probably not going to get him. So you want to plan to visit, and whenever you're going, a couple of different banks. Now, a country like Georgia, if they say, why do you want it? And they're going to be more open. Okay, fine, great. We have to put something down. They're happy to open non-resident accounts. You want to pick where you're going to go, and you want to go in person to visit some different banks. Now, the alternatives to going in person, which I actually think may be long-term, number one, it's just less paperwork, which means less expense, particularly in the case of some of the more expensive, fancy banks. They're going to ask you to do stuff that's going to be a bit more expensive. But remote bank account opening generally means it's either really high end. So, in Switzerland, some of those banks will let you open remotely, but we're talking generally $1 million plus or $1 million francs plus. There's some banks like the Bahamas that do take non-residents, and you can do that remotely. Any bank in like a place that's so far away, like Vanuatu or the Cook Islands, they don't really expect you to go there. It's going to be quite a palaver, as they say. I don't know that I want a bank in Vanuatu. That's not really the answer. Most offshore banks, Dominica as well. St. Lucia doesn't have as much anymore, but like those kind of places, they'll do it remotely, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be cheaper. It might be, $5,000 or $10,000. But some of these remote banks charge higher fees. Swiss banks charge higher fees for everything, but like an offshore bank in the Caribbean, they make money on fees. Puerto Rico's a whole bunch of banks now, and they'll often open remotely. They don't have the same FDIC protection as other U.S. banks. But, these offshore banks, like in kind of island jurisdictions, are going to be perhaps inefficient. Like Mauritius just isn't that efficient. The Seychelles is kind of frustrating. You can do those remotely because it's like, they don't really expect people to go to the Seychelles. So it's like the really high-end one where I'm going to pay fees because it's high-end, and they're going to ask me for a bunch of stuff, and they're not going to care if they get my $1 million or not. Like, we have plenty of money. I remember one banker once told me, my best customer have $192 million in bank. And you're like, yeah. And it was kind of like, as Swiss bankers are wont to do, yeah, you're one or two. Nobody cares. Like, yeah, this guy, look at this guy, he's much better than you. Or, with those kind of smaller, sometimes rinky-dink banks, Belize, it's just like they're going to be charging you fees because that's how they make money. Some of these smaller banks, they don't even hold your money. They just go and put it in other larger banks, kind of a master account. And so they make money based on charging you fees, opening fees, monthly fees, quarterly fees, whatever. And so remotely can work if you want kind of a traditional offshore bank that has higher fees. A Georgian bank, you're going to pay like $8 a year for the debit card and maybe a couple other things, but like really you're not going to pay much at all. Whereas like some of these banks in the Caribbean, they might charge you $100 a month, and they're going to be slower, and the online banking is not going to be as good. So, you can do remote account opening through a power of attorney. We have, as I said, someone who does that for folks. You sign a power of attorney, they go in and they act as you in person. But remote accounts are going to be high-end or low-end often. If you're thinking Cayman Islands, for example, is one of the Caribbean options, they generally want people who have a real connection there. And so a lot of jurisdictions, especially, again, if they just have too much money, or if their central bank is just, really as concerns, they may not want to take you on. So the solution to opening up more offshore banking options is residence. I wouldn't even say citizenship, because people think they're going to get a Caribbean citizenship by investment and then just go to Antigua and be taken seriously. Like, they know you don't really have any connection with Antigua. But if you're a resident, it's like, oh, okay, you have a connection. You're a resident, like you're spending time here. And so, in a country like Armenia, all the way up to various countries in Europe, or let's say you get a golden visa, you don't have to live in Europe with a golden visa, but you have the residence permit. Maybe you have to go there every once in a while. The UAE potentially could open for a non-resident. That's one place to go. And I'd say I'm not blown away by the service in Dubai compared to Singapore. It is not comparable yet, but I think it's stable. It's just the service isn't there yet. But if you were to get a UAE residence permit, let's say by opening a company, that could be part of just, either asset protection or part of moving your company offshore, you can then go and get a personal account at one of the banks, and I think those are probably pretty safe. Obviously, do your own due diligence. But getting a residence permit, I mean, all throughout the Gulf, I mean, Bahrain, for example, the other countries, you get buy a property, get a residence permit, get a bank account. So sometimes you want to look at opening a bank account in the context of what else should I be doing? Because I don't think bank accounts in a vacuum really solve the problem. Where we started with, is it in your personal name, your business name? Is it in a trust name? You want to plan for what money goes where. You want to plan for what you're trying to accomplish. Is this money you're going to spend? Is this money you're going to save? Is this money you're going to invest? What are you trying to do with this money? It all goes into a different kind of bank. And so I think that if the goal is, some of this is saying, I want to be diversified internationally, banking isn't where it should stop. I really think that if you open a bank account in Malaysia, you can then get residence. So you apply for the MM2H, you can put it in between 32,000 and about 240 some thousand, depending on which part of Malaysia you want to go and spend a little bit of time in every year. They're going to make you open a bank account to finalize that. They're also going to make you buy health insurance, which is insanely cheap. And now you're in a country of medical tourism, so you can go, and check in and get all your health stuff done. I go to Prince Court Hospital every year. I get great service. So it's think of banking in the context of what else am I doing? You can go to Georgia, you can go to Ecuador, you can go to maybe Portugal, you can remotely go to Switzerland, the Bahamas, places like that. Some of the teeny tiny islands from, Cook Islands to Dominica. I mean, those are all places at varying levels where you can get accounts. But you can really expand that when you start making connections. And so if I put some money in bonds in Armenia, I need the bank to do that. I get the bonds, I get the residence permit. Then once I'm a resident of Armenia, I have access to their banks. They've got some European banks there. They're not all local banks. They've got some European banks, the French banks, for example, that are stable. What if I go and get a residence permit by buying any property in any of the Balkan countries? You can buy property on the Albanian coast for $25,000, 25,000 euros. It's not going to be a palace for 25,000 euros, but you can buy property in the coast. It's one of the hidden gems. Maybe Albania, if they kind of understood why you're there, would open a bank account. We've done that in the past. They might be a little bit confused, but if you had a property, even just without a residence permit, having a property can often get you in. And so if you're starting to build, a second home or a collection of homes or a collection of backup properties or investment properties where you have to collect the rent, that can help. But if you then use the property to get a residence permit, okay, that makes sense. I understand why you're here. So it's kind of making people understand why you're here. Because, in the United States, the central bank tells the other central banks who deal in dollars what to do. And so anyone who wants to move dollars overseas, there's a few more questions to be asked. But if you can satisfy people, I think going in person is probably a good way to do it. And you get a sense of comfort with where your money's going to be. Otherwise, you look at remote account opening options, or as in Georgia, you can have somebody, who you trust do power of attorney and have kind of a remote process where the bank doesn't offer it, but you have someone working in your behalf. So those are some of the things I consider when I'm trying to open an offshore bank account. And just remember that nothing happens in a vacuum. So what Nomad Capitalist does is help you figure out all the things we just talked about. We don't do a la carte offshore bank account openings because it's just kind of to say, hey, we'll get you an account at this bank. I don't think anyone's that successful at that anymore, honestly. There's people who will help you open a company in Hong Kong and they're still telling you they'll get you an HSBC account. Last I checked, it's not 2014 anymore. It just doesn't work. I don't even know how they can say that. Obviously, anytime, we talk about banks, there's times where I could have sworn that bank would have worked for you, but they weren't interested. All right, here's the next best one. We help people figure out not only a holistic plan of where to bank, but again, how do you add residences or citizenships or properties or other stuff that not only facilitates your banking, but helps solve the greater conundrum of why you want to bank. You want to protect your assets. You want to be diversified. Well, do it beyond banking. That's what we help you do at Nomad Capitalist. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com/apply.